Hi, welcome back to part 2 on assessment. In part 1, we explored and defined assessment, feedback, reflection, improvement, and evaluation, all in an effort to help you define those terms for your own teaching. You also utilized the backward design approach again, this time to plan out assessment strategies. For today's session, we'll be focusing on the purpose and the difference between 3 different types of assessment. I'll use 2 learning strategies, which include a quiz and a think, pair, share activity, or a question prompt. The roadmap for this overarching module, as you know, began in part 1 with defining those terms, and today really thinking about the types of assessment that you could use. In part 3, we'll explore some learning domains and some models as you think about how you can be more effective in your own assessment practices. And then in part 4, we'll explore specific tools and approaches that you can incorporate. So as I mentioned, there are 3 primary forms of assessment. The first is diagnostic, which is really conceived of as assessment for learning. So what do you know? What do you already know? Formative assessment is assessment as learning, so thinking about what are you learning at any given point. Summative assessment is of learning, so what have you learned in a course, in a session, or in a learning activity? So these 3 types of assessment can be understood in the simplest way before, during, and at the end. So as you're thinking about your course map, imagine where these pieces might fall. If we imagine some examples, we'll use our course objective example from part 1. Students explain key milestones and debates in the history of anesthesiology. So how might we consider diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment that are related to this objective? So for example, what do we need to know before students begin? What do students know about the history of anesthesiology before the course starts? And then for formative, what would we like to know during the teaching process? What are students learning about key historical debates in the field through their assignments? What can we gather in real time that gives us a sense of how they're progressing towards their ultimate course goal? And then lastly, which key milestones and debates can students identify by the end of the course? So what information would we like to have at the end of the process to know they've been successful? So let's dig into some of the specific ways that we can gather information that we need for assessment. We'll highlight some tools and go into this in greater depth in part 4. But when we think about diagnostic and what we need to know, there's some typical tools that you can use before learning. Can you think of what those might be? They could be any of these. This is not a comprehensive list, but will give you a sense of ways that you can assess your learners before the point in time that you're providing the content or doing the skill development. That could be screening, pretest diagnostic, inventories, observation, concept maps, questioning. Any of these could be conducted before as a diagnostic assessment. For a formative assessment, you could imagine checks for understanding, quizzes, some of which I've incorporated in our session today, checklists, questionnaires. And summative may be something that you imagine a final exam, a final presentation, a written report. So these are some different ways that you could solicit and gather information to perform your assessment. If we go back to our course example and the ways that we would imagine the diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment, let's think about some particular tools that we could use for these purposes. Think about it yourself for a moment. What kinds of assessment tools, some of the ones I mentioned on the slide before, do you think might be appropriate for these particular approaches? Maybe a pretest or a group mind map to give you a sense of foundational knowledge before you begin the course. Quizzes, even low-stake quizzes, observations of group work, can be a way to assess during the experience. And then final presentations or written tests can be a way to evaluate a learner at the end of a course session or learning activity. So when we look at these examples and tools for assessment, it still raises in our mind this question of how do we know what specific tools to use for a given learning experience? So the choice of tools should be guided by three primary questions. One, what are your end goals? Think back to the backward design process. What is your course goal? What resources do you already have available? So are students already taking required tests that give you valuable information? Are they already doing group work that you can observe? What technology is even available to you? And then what data do you need? So the goal of assessment shouldn't be to collect as much information as possible, but rather to collect information that you need, when you need it, and how you need it. And so when we're thinking about the formative, what are you learning, and the summative, what have you learned, they can be guided by these questions. So some examples. What is your end goal? Demonstrate content knowledge and apply that to solve a problem. What resources do you have? Course computers, student cell phones, requirement practicum, state exams. What data do you need, either qualitative or quantitative, as an individual or as a group? So do you plan to use formative assessments in your lessons? Yes. Not sure? No. So formative assessments can look at how students are learning. It's a process which is planned in advance. It's used to tell us how students are learning and if we need to adjust how we're teaching and to give students feedback so they can adjust even their approach to learning as needed. So it's a process, it's planned, it's used to verify learning or make adjustments and for student feedback and action. So it can be as simple as the thumbs up, thumbs down activity that I just introduced you to. So that took less than a minute and it let me know, or it would have let me know if we were face to face, about your experiences and level of understanding about the concept. So it can be simple or it can be more complex. When we think about some formative assessment approaches, these are some of the ones that you can consider. There are many others, of which, as I mentioned, we'll explore in greater depth in Part 4. Summative assessments, as opposed to formative assessments, are really compared against that overall standard. They're used to evaluate knowledge and skill acquisition at the conclusion of the learning experience and used to determine if the student is ready to progress. So have they mastered the learning objectives by the end? They're both equally important, summative and formative, but oftentimes the summative assessments are really prioritized. Sometimes they're easier to do. Some tools to conduct summative assessments will include some of these. You may notice that some of these tools were also included in our formative assessment list. So as noted previously, many tools will have be the same, but maybe administered at separate times for different purposes. So our session objectives today were to describe the purpose and the differences between diagnostic, summative, and formative assessment approaches. I'll ask you to apply your learning, identifying 2 to 3 assessment strategies that you might use with your learners. Why did you choose those strategies or even those tools? How might those inform your own understanding of your student success? I'll see you in Part 3.